All these states are therefore subject to the federal restriction of 725. So that's just a brief history of minimum wages. So let's examine the arguments for and against the proposals in the 2023 Raise the Wage Act. Its sponsors intend to gradually increase the minimum to $17 an hour by 2028. If signed into law, this bill will directly affect almost 15 million workers. That's 10% of the workforce. More than half of them are teenagers. More than half, and most of them belong to one or more minority groups, such as Blacks, Hispanics, or females.
Now, in case you wondered, looking at the YouTube link with the two boxers, I'm the one in red, the leftist one, and she's the one in yellow, the libertarian one. So I'll start with the case for raising the minimum wage. Surprise. Okay. Assume that the increase in the cost of using those low-skilled workers has no impact on the decision of employers to keep and to hire them. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that almost 28 million employees will get a raise. Sounds great. The annual benefits of a $16 minimum wage rate are projected to reach $86 billion. That's $3,100 more for each individual minimum wage earner. These experts claim that millions of, quote, essential and frontline workers have been left behind, especially in red southern states. In expensive metro areas, the Institute lobbies for legislators to consider that a single adult without children must be paid much more. $31.20 in Los Angeles, $33.60 in Washington, D.C., and $36.20 in New York City. And that's just to pay for the basic necessities of life. The conclusion is that passing the Raise the Wage Act will play a crucial role in protecting the vulnerable from being exploited. It would reverse decades of growing income inequalities. Low wages, note the activists of the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, I quote, hurt all workers and are particularly harmful to Black workers and other workers of color, especially women of color, who make up a disproportionate share of workers who are severely underpaid. This is the result of structural racism and sexism, with an economic system rooted in chattel slavery, in which these workers continue to be shunned into the most underpaid jobs, end of quote. In other words, capitalism is designed to benefit white males. How? By squeezing employees with darker skin and no Y chromosomes. The proposed solution includes government restrictions in the labor market, such as minimum wage laws. We are also told to eliminate current exemptions like sub-minimum wages for tipped, disabled, and teenage employees. Those are seen as egregious and unacceptable. Based on two papers, one from the American Economic Journal from 2016 and one from the Quarterly Journal in Economics from 2021, the Economic Policy Institute asserts that, I quote, minimum wage increases in the late 60s explained 20% of the decrease in the Black-white earnings gap in the years that followed, whereas failures to adequately increase the minimum wage after 1979 account for almost half of the increase in inequality between women at the middle and bottom of the wage distribution, end quote. So, let's translate that into regular English. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, we mark 60 years now from that experiment, lifted women and racial minorities out of poverty. Then the election of Ronald Reagan pushed them back down. Today's black workers with supposedly identical characteristics as white workers are paid, the Institute claims, 10 to 15% less. The increase of the minimum wage to $17 per hour will benefit the oppressed minority the most. Last year, the Center for American Progress presented their own predictions. Raising the minimum hourly wage to just $15 an hour could, I quote, increase the wages of 1 in 4 workers, that's nearly 40 million people, and lead to an annual wage increase as large as $8,000 for some of the lowest wage workers, end of quote. The publication presents the Raise the Wage Act as, I quote again, an investment in growing the middle class and a clear way to build an economic security of workers and their families. The most attractive feature of this federal mandate, according to the Center for American Progress, is the expected reduction in the stubborn gender, racial, and ethnic pay gaps. Such evils, they claim, happen because America's labor markets are distorted by occupational segregation and discrimination. The National Employment Law Project also argues in favor of passing the Raise the Wage Act. It will have multiple benefits, they say. I quote, by providing families with higher incomes, minimum wage increases have improved a range of important health, well-being, and educational outcomes, including infant health, mental health, children's math and reading scores, and educational attainment, and have also reduced death of despair, child abuse, and teenage pregnancy. Further, adopting the Keynesian fiscal multiplier theory, the Economic Policy Institute predicts that giving the poor workers a raise of $86 billion annually will have a significant positive externality effect on their communities. I quote, because underpaid workers spend much of their extra earnings, they say, this injection of wages will help stimulate the economy and spur greater business activity and job growth. The Center for American Progress concurs that raising the minimum wage will boost consumption spending and energize local economies. You can imagine it working something like this, okay? Your neighbor's teen daughter, Kamala, gets a government-mandated raise of $3,200 as a grocery bagger at Kroger. The extra cash allows her to watch a movie every night at the theater you own. Your daily revenue goes up by $8.50. Now you can order an extra burger with your lunch. That's more money for the local Popeyes owner. And on it goes. Assuming no savings and taxes, your town's economy can reach for the stars. A slightly more believable scenario is presented by a moderate left-leaning institution, the Brookings. Their experts discount the objections of free market economists who point out that only a very small share of workers actually receive the minimum wage. And furthermore, that many of those workers are not struggling adults, but rather teenagers from affluent families. The Brookings Hamilton Project predicts that workers who earn up to 50% more than the statutory minimum would also benefit in a ripple effect. Potentially, this will increase the earnings of 3 out of every 10 people in the labor force. However, These experts also acknowledge that passing the Raise the Wage Act will have potential negative employment effects. A paper co-authored by a professor at Penn School of Social Policy and Practice is quick to alleviate our fears. The higher cost of one resource, such as low-skilled labor, won't lower the quantity of it used by the producer, we are told. In an attempt to disprove the law of demand, the publication finds that, quote, in labor markets that are more concentrated or less densely populated, minimum wage increases lead to overall positive employment effects, end of quote. Somehow, monopsonist markets create incentives for business owners to hire more workers when forced to pay more money. The American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO, is the greatest special interest group. It represents more than 12 million active and retired workers in the United States. It's made up of 60 national and international unions. They are also one of the strongest advocates for raising the minimum wage. They point out that it was last raised in 2009. By 2023, the minimum wage has lost 15% of its purchasing power. We should add that after the Biden-Harris inflation last year, things are much worse for those workers today. Do the unions point a finger at Congress and the White House for running huge deficits that tripled our debt? Do they blame the Fed for tripling the money supply in the past 15 years? Of course not. The unions demand that we make it illegal for low-skilled workers to offer their services at less than $15 an hour. But why does a special interest group representing highly skilled employees who earn much more than the federal minimum spend their members' money on such proposals? We'll get into that later.
All right, my turn for a knockout punch. Ready? All right, here's why we shouldn't raise the minimum wage. In evaluating the latest proposals to increase the federal minimum wage, the Congressional Budget Office analyzed its impacts on employment, family income, and poverty rates. The report starts by acknowledging the fact that a higher mandated pay for individuals whose lack of skills mean low productivity raises labor costs for the firm. The added business expenditures of compliance with the new restrictions translate into lower profits. Inevitably, this will force some employers to turn to alternatives such as hiring more experienced workers or replacing labor with capital, outsourcing, and of course, our favorite nowadays, AI. The Congressional Budget Office concludes that the Raise the Wage Act will hurt many more poor people in America. They note some employers would employ fewer workers than they would have employed under a lower minimum wage. The higher cost of hiring the lower skilled workers will decrease opportunities to find jobs. This could discourage and push millions of them out of the labor force entirely. So while joblessness will increase as a result of passing the bill, it might not be registered as higher unemployment according to the official definition. The report also mentions that for certain workers, or in some circumstances, employment could increase. We agree with this conclusion, but we'll show who benefits the most from this proposal later on. Some workers will be out of work indefinitely so that they never benefited from higher wages. Others might move constantly in and out of employment, relying on welfare checks while waiting for a job opportunity that offers higher wages during the weeks they were employed. The real, that is, adjusted for inflation, income of low-wage workers who manage to keep their jobs will go up. This might lift some of those families out of poverty. For other families, however, income would fall because some workers simply wouldn't be employed. What's the likely overall effect? The Congressional Budget Office report concludes that A minimum wage increase generally causes a net reduction in average family income. Lost employment opportunities will push some American families below the poverty threshold. Economic models, of course, suffer from more uncertainty than even the climate change estimates. No one can predict future entrepreneurial innovations and how they'll improve productivity and impact the demand for unskilled workers. The report notes that it's possible for the Raise the Wage Act to be passed and for our statisticians to measure a decline in the total number of people considered poor by American standards. However, aside from the benefits of free enterprise, increasing the minimum wage will make the most vulnerable people unemployable. This will harm the health and well-being of the jobless, of their families, and their communities. Let's not forget that just 4 years ago, because of COVID restrictions, we conducted a nationwide experiment that demonstrated the significant negative effects of unemployment, including obesity, depression, substance abuse, household violence, academic failure, crime, suicide, cringy TikTok videos. Last year, experts at Wharton published a paper warning that an increase of the minimum wage does not ensure higher pay or better employment opportunities. It may even lower the workers' long-term welfare. What proponents of the Raise the Wage Act forget to ask is how easy and how quickly it would be for the affected employers to find substitutes of the now relatively more expensive low-skilled workers. The study finds that an increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour would lower the long-run employment rates of approximately 60% of non-college workers who initially earn less. The model estimates that the biggest loser of the Raise the Wage Act are concentrated among a fifth of the workers who earn less than $10 an hour before the wage increase. In other words, trying to help the poor by raising the minimum wage will be counterproductive. The libertarian Cato experts explain how government requirements that low-skilled workers be paid higher wages force employers to adjust in ways which hurt the very poor people that the law pretends to help. Some of the most common responses include reduced hiring, cutting employee work hours, reducing benefits, and charging higher prices. Policymakers who have never run their own business may naively assume that firms will pay the higher labor costs by reducing their own profits. In reality, that rarely ever happens. What entrepreneurs do in such cases is cut employment and make other decisions to maintain their net earnings. A common business strategy for adjusting to higher minimum wages is to change your employees' schedules. A study for the Harvard Business Review found that a significant number of workers in 45 stores across California lost benefits when the government tried to help. Data collected on 5,000 employees between 2015 and 2018 shows that just a $1 increase in the minimum wage can inflict a lot of pain. They report the percentage of workers working more than 20 hours per week, which makes them eligible for retirement benefits, decreased by 23%, while the percentage of workers with more than 30 hours per week, which makes them eligible for healthcare benefits, decreased by almost 15%. The net result of the low-skilled workers in a typical California store was negative. The total wage compensation decreased by almost 14%. The damage, however, wasn't limited to just reduced wage compensation and the loss of employee benefits. When employers were forced to make the work schedules less consistent, the employees found it much harder to find a good balance between their work and their personal lives. For many, it also became much more challenging to juggle multiple jobs to earn enough money to cover bills. The report concludes that raising the minimum wage by $1 reduces the average employee's annual wage compensation by no less than $1,500. Being forced to work fewer hours, losing retirement and health benefits, and experiencing increased schedule inconsistency was equivalent to almost a 12% drop in their income. The effects were lower employee satisfaction and motivation, fewer opportunities to improve their skills through on-the-job training, and higher turnover rates for the firms due to reduced ability to hire and keep better workers. For the economy, that means lower long-run productivity gains and suppressed economic growth. We don't doubt that the road to these laws, which impose restrictions on the labor markets, is mostly paved with good intentions. Unfortunately, the other main ingredient is economic ignorance. A good example of this dangerous mix is Seattle's mayor, Ed Murray, back in 2014. He bragged how his administration mandated a gradual increase in the minimum wage from $9.32 to $15 an hour, predicting it would lift tens of thousands of families out of poverty and make Seattle more equitable and affordable for all who live here. Alongside Seattle, New York, and Oakland, California led a campaign that resulted in some of the toughest wage restrictions across the country at the start of the century. Sharply increasing their minimum wages, these areas also experienced some of the worst homelessness during the 2010s. Cato conducted research on 204 American municipalities from 2006 to 2019 to evaluate that connection. When the minimum wage exceeds the market value of a low-skilled worker's output, he becomes unemployable. No manager in a private firm will hire or retain an employee when labor costs exceed sales revenues. Those who lose their jobs first are the most vulnerable employees. They not only have the lowest productivity, but often lack education, don't have a car, reside in areas with no buses or trains, or live in households with a host of problems like substance abuse and mental illness. These factors make the victims of minimum wage restrictions more exposed to economic insecurities and homelessness. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, relative to towns with no change in the nominal minimum wage, municipalities where it rose by less than $1 from 2013 to 2015 suffered a 15% rise in homelessness between 2014 and 2019. Where the minimum wage jumped by more than $1 an hour from 2013 to 2015, homelessness rose 25% in the subsequent years. As more time passed, the problem got worse. The explanation of this outcome is quite simple. When payment of work-related activities grows by political decree, such as minimum wage laws, instead of market changes, such as increased productivity, employees with fewer skills face more competition. Workers from other regions migrate to cities with higher wages, increasing the cost of rent for local people. Those who are voluntarily unemployed now have a stronger incentive to enter the labor market. And as a result, more productive workers displace the ones that government intervention intended to lift out of poverty. We all start our productive lives as young people with no experience and very few marketable skills. I was one of those people, maybe still am. Those of us who have ambitions to build a career need entry-level jobs to start. We have to start climbing the proverbial ladder to financial success. Politicians and activists like to present their proposals of raising the minimum wage as a catapult that propels the unskilled workers to a better life faster. In reality, their laws break the bottom steps of that professional ladder. Political restrictions on the labor markets are a bad deal for the workers, everywhere, every time. The more underdeveloped the economy and the more unskilled the individual worker, the more detrimental the effects are. A gross monthly minimum wage of 900 euros in Greece may be harming more workers than the required 2,000 euros in Germany. For wealthy countries, minimum wage increases trap some individuals in relative poverty. For weaker economies with less productive workforces, these market distortions cause a lot more pain. In America, a nationwide ban on hiring below a certain hourly rate is more harmful than state and local mandates because of regional variations in living costs, policy preferences, and other economic realities. For example, a $17 minimum wage in rural Kansas, Oklahoma, or Mississippi may be equivalent to twice as much in New York City, Los Angeles, or the District of Columbia. Like many other government interventions in our free enterprise system, minimum wage laws tilt the playing field in favor of big corporations against small and new businesses. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2019 shows that firms with less than 100 employees paid an average weekly wage of $976. That is where you find almost half of America's minimum wage workers. Private businesses with more than 1,000 workers, on the other hand, paid almost twice as much, $1,900 per week. A working paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research indicates that increases in the federal minimum wage worsen the financial health of small businesses in the lower income areas, leading to limited access to bank credit, increase in loan defaults, declining employment numbers, a lower entry, and a higher exit rate for small businesses. A previous study investigated the link between minimum wages and startup survival rates in America between 1982 and 2014. The conclusion was that a 1% increase in the minimum wage is associated with a 3.5% decline in the survival rates of startups. Even the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office agrees that increasing the minimum wage will hurt millions of Americans. They conclude that pushing it up to $15 an hour will destroy between 1.4 and 2.7 million jobs. Those will result from cutting employees' hours, layoffs, replacing workers with machines, outsourcing, and closing their businesses. Raising the minimum wage makes it much harder for individuals with little work experience and low skills to find gainful employment. When the minimum wage is set above the market value of the goods and services produced by you, no firm will ever hire you. When the job requires training to acquire specific skills and the government mandates that the firm pay more than the market equilibrium, career opportunities for inexperienced employees evaporate. A study by the Heritage Foundation suggests alternatives to raising the minimum wage that could create real income gains instead of destroying opportunities for the poor. Long-term solutions could include expanding education and job training so people can gain more valuable skills that they can use to work their way up the ladder and eventually make more than the minimum wage. Reducing unnecessary government regulations that cost businesses considerable money to follow, freeing up that money so they can pay their employees more or invest in growing their businesses, ultimately creating more jobs and higher wages. The study also advocates for significant changes in costly occupational licensing imposed by state governments. There is no evidence that licenses improve consumer protection. What they do, however, is increase prices and limit choices. Those licenses often come with high fees and many hours of unnecessary training, preventing low-skilled Americans and immigrants from starting new careers. Instead of imposing higher barriers for poor people in the form of minimum wages and entry requirements, we should make it easier for them to work as barbers, cosmetologists, landscapers, and so on. We all want good paying jobs to raise happy families and chase our American dreams. Free enterprise has created those great opportunities for most of us to do exactly that. For those who have fallen behind in reaping all the benefits, For those who have fallen behind in reaping all the benefits of this amazing progress during the past 2 centuries, it would be a grave disservice to demand heavy-handed government mandates in the hope that they will somehow lift people up. If we want more jobs and higher wages, we need to focus our efforts on removing all government-created barriers to work. The freer the market and the more competition we have for labor services, the easier it will be for each worker to find a job which offers a package deal, wages and benefits, that reflect their contribution towards satisfying the needs of the customer. Another study by the Heritage Foundation examines the effects of raising minimum wages to $17 per hour on childcare costs. Those are expected to rise, ready for it, by 20% throughout the country. For the average family with 2 children, that translates to an additional expense of over $4,000 a year. The lower the cost of living in your state, the worse that law will impact you. Parents in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia may be forced to pay between 41 and 48% more for childcare. If you currently pay $10 per hour for 10 hours of after-school care a week, you'll be forced to pay $70 more each week. A price increase of $3,640 a year means that many working families will no longer be able to afford those childcare services. In 2-parent households, one of the spouses, usually the mom, may be forced to quit working, resulting in even lower income for the family, as well as loss of childcare jobs. Exiting the labor market is obviously not an option for the most vulnerable, single-parent households. Poor women will be pushed to turn to non-licensed and often illegal childcare providers, with increased risks for the well-being of their children. Ways to alleviate the pain of increasing the minimum wage include easing regulations on childcare providers, allowing lower-income parents to use Head Start funds at a provider of their choice, eliminating barriers to employer-provided childcare, and making it easier for parents to save for childcare by enacting universal savings accounts. When the Democratic Party took control of both houses of Congress and won the presidential elections of 2020, federal spending exploded. The expansionary Keynesian policy was coupled with unprecedented financial rewards for not working. These interventions increased the demand for and restricted the supply of labor, driving up nominal wages. The White House may boast that between 21 and 23, the annual income of Joe the plumber increased sharply by $4,300. Unfortunately, during that same period, inflation lowered his real income by $7,000. The net result of Bidenomics on blue-collar workers has been equivalent to hitting each one of them with an additional $2,700 annual tax. Wage increases, notes the study, are a great thing when they come from workers becoming more productive. But when they come from government mandates, they simply shift costs around. Some people lose their jobs, others lose their workplace benefits and have their hours reduced. And across the economy, family incomes decline and prices rise. A publication of the Mises Institute analyzes the now infamous findings of Card and Kruger on the effects of raising the minimum wage on the fast food industry in Philadelphia. The city presents an interesting case since it is split between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and some neighborhoods are subject to different rules. In April 1992, New Jersey raised its minimum wage by 80 cents an hour, while Pennsylvania's restrictions remained unchanged. The study found higher prices for fast food on the New Jersey side, but no negative effects on employment in the industry. The value of the data was limited by the lack of research on employment in other sectors. Card and Kruger also focused on a single city for just 2 years after the minimum wage was increased. As Frederick Bastiat could have told them, economists should not concern themselves only with the visible short-term effects of policy changes. The higher cost of fast food meals has undoubtedly reduced consumption of other goods in the area. Ceteris paribus, that is, all things stay the same, which must have lowered revenues in other industries. Those invisible, delayed, and diffused costs translates into lower investment and fewer overall job opportunities on the New Jersey side of Philadelphia. A commentary at the Independent Institute's website elaborates on additional reasons why empirical studies on minimum wage laws fail to measure their full disemploying effects. When politics distorts the market price for unskilled labor with the intention to benefit the employee, it forces the employer to alter other parameters of the contract. Cost is a cost, is a cost, is a cost. If you have to pay higher wages, you'll have to cut other labor-related expenses, making the job less pleasant, safe, or rewarding in other unpredictable ways. Setting a price floor on any good or service above the equilibrium price creates a surplus, shifting the bargaining power from the seller to the buyer. Employers may keep the same number of workers, paying more in wages while economizing on electricity by keeping the office cooler in the winter and warmer in the summer. But lower electricity demand may destroy jobs in the energy sector. Managers may cut costs in all kinds of ways by no longer offering free snacks, coffee, which I routinely take advantage of at my workplace, concert tickets, gym memberships, negatively impacting those other businesses. They demand more and better work results from their employees. It's impossible to figure out where and when such non-wage adjustments will take place. The indirect effects of the minimum wage are virtually undetectable by econometricians. Demand for labor, of course, is downward sloping. However, instead of measuring the quantity of workers on the horizontal axis, we should use labor hours. The artificially high price per hour for hiring less productive individuals may not necessarily decrease the number of such employees, but an increase in the minimum wage could merely lower the number of hours they work. When you cut costs by installing a kiosk at your burger joint, you'll no longer need as many teenagers on deck at any given time. Now you can rotate them. They come to work every other day. Underemployment will decrease their total income, yet the careless or biased researcher will report none of that. You may also decide to close your restaurant between 2 and 5 when business is too slow. In that case, instead of having a single employee work from 11 to 8, you might hire 2 people for separate 3-hour shifts. Ironically, this job loss will be measured as increased employment in the fast food industry. Politics is backward-looking. To win votes and gain power, you must respond to past problems. Unlike politicians, successful entrepreneurs are good at anticipating and adapting to future events. They act preemptively to forecast how policy proposals will affect their bottom line over the next few years. Increasing the minimum wage takes a long time to convince enough legislators to vote for it. Long before the proposal becomes law, business owners start to prepare for that expected cost increase. That makes it very hard for even the most conscientious scholar. Pardon me, lost myself. It makes it hard for the most conscientious scholar to measure the negative impacts of such labor restrictions on low-skilled employees. In the case of Card and Kruger, the author's eagerness to prove that minimum wage increases don't harm the poor led them to collect data on employment just a few weeks before the law was implemented. That way, they could turn a blind eye to the job losses that likely occurred months before. Some of the adjustments to higher production costs may come years after the data is collected and the paper on minimum wages is submitted to the journal for peer reviews. The negative spillovers of political interventions in the economy are unpredictable and immeasurable. Alkion's second law of demand warns that price elasticity of demand grows over time. In a long process of trial and error that is unique for every business, the entrepreneurs will figure out the best way to rearrange their production, finding lower cost alternatives for the now relatively more expensive unskilled labor. Even when the prices of consumer goods change, it can take buyers a period to discover suitable substitutes. Production, being more complex, usually takes longer. The article provides 2 examples of these kinds of adjustments from 7 years ago. When the minimum wage was increased in the 1950s, low-skilled individuals who worked at movie theater ushers and elevator operators didn't lose their jobs right away. Had a study been sponsored by the labor unions to measure the immediate effects of the new restrictions on unemployment, it may have easily presented empirical evidence that such policies benefit the poor. Today, we all know what happened. Pushed by the government to eliminate more costly ingredients, the low-skilled workers, employers invested in new technologies. It took some time, but eventually those jobs were completely eliminated by the installation of light strips on the floor of our movie theaters and by the introduction of automatic elevators. These stories show that it's impossible for researchers to determine how long after raising the minimum wage they must collect data to detect all effects. Finally, minimum wages are usually increased during economic booms, not busts. These are typically times with accelerated inflation and job creation. Such macroeconomic conditions can mask some of the resulting employment. Because the real minimum wage is falling, the higher nominal minimum wage is less binding and there will be less job loss than otherwise. If your before was a normal period or a downturn and your after is a boom, you won't catch the impact of the wage restrictions on unemployment. The net economic losses and the harm done to the most vulnerable individuals are not the only concerns. Minimum wage laws are also morally wrong. Political acts that criminalize free choices of free individuals violate our inalienable rights. There's no moral justification for demanding that our public servants dictate the terms of trade between consenting adults. If you and I enter into a contractual agreement, it is only because we both expect to gain more than what we would give up. No one disputes that any employer, prefers to pay less. It's just as clear that every seller or worker will be better off if they can receive more money. Whatever the exchange rate, price, or wage happens to be, as long as there is no force or fraud, the market participants walk away more satisfied. I may have my reasons to believe that one side of this exchange is being ripped off, but my feelings give me no right to meddle in the lives of others and demand that someone pays more or another charges less. And if it's criminal for me to use threats of violence against those who deviate from the prices I prefer, it should be just as criminal for elected public servants to impose minimum wage restrictions and rent controls. The government is a tool to be used for protecting our rights. It should not be abused to harass, plunder, and incarcerate those who make voluntary choices that generate mutual benefit. Another publication of the Mises Institute notes the arrogant approach of some elitist economists whose cost-benefit analysis leads them to conclude that the destruction of jobs from raising the minimum wage isn't too severe. Such studies claim that financial gains to workers who keep their jobs at the higher mandated wage exceeds the losses of other workers who are laid off or never get hired. There's no ground to make such proclamations. How can anyone claim to know how much harm is done to a person who cannot find legal employment? How can you measure the losses to a young person or an unskilled immigrant who never finds an honest job because of the minimum wage? Even if it's true that some workers benefit from higher pay, their gains can't be compared with the long-term suffering of those who are rendered unemployable. And with that, I win my knockout, I think.
And in case you wonder how we're going to answer the last 3 questions on the quiz, here it comes. Ready? Okay. With evidence overwhelmingly demonstrating the counterproductive effects of minimum wage laws, one may be mystified by the widespread support of these harmful restrictions in America as well as in many other countries. Why would hundreds of millions of people support proposals whose effects, as we just heard, are the opposite of the announced intentions to improve the lives of poor workers? Well, to answer this question, it should be fairly obvious, I believe. You just have to remember that we all act out of self-interest. Let's consider the following 3 groups of decision makers: voters, their public servants, and union bosses. Start with the voters. Most of the electorate is, in the words of Hayek, and we celebrate this year is 80 years since he published The Road to Serfdom, and also 50 years from the time when he was awarded a Nobel Prize in economics. So Hayek had coined this term, economophobic. So most of the electorate is economophobic. Even if you give such people compelling facts and sound reasoning, as we did tonight, against their beliefs, many will choose to stay willfully ignorant. Voters want to feel good about themselves and to be perceived as compassionate, supporting candidates who promise to impose tougher minimum wage restrictions is a low-cost way of virtue signaling. It's like wearing a mask or displaying a rainbow flag. The second category of players are the people who run for office in the state and national legislatures. Their motivations are as transparent as it gets. They all need votes, and most of them crave the power that comes with the job. With so many gullible voters, a promise how raising the minimum wage will improve the life of the poor worker by shrinking the profit of the greedy entrepreneur is the politician's low-cost way of virtue signaling in the pursuit of selfish goals. It is even possible that some of these legislators come to believe their own lies. The third group, there is a third group of decision makers whose motivations are well hidden from the general public and their political role most nefarious. They are the honchos of some of the best organized special interest groups. As Milton Friedman noted in his Free to Choose chapter on who protects the worker, their experts are the chief promoters of raising the minimum wage, considering that unionized employees who pay for those campaigns earn wages that are well above the proposed minimums. One may be tempted to conclude that their guilds do it out of solidarity. Any professional guild, however, exists with the sole purpose of promoting the interests of its members. In many fields, skilled and unskilled labor are substitutes. The only way that less productive workers can compete against those who are more talented and experienced is by offering to be paid less per hour. The most effective way for the skilled members of a labor union to obtain higher incomes and more job security is to make unskilled labor more expensive through political manipulations. Thus, the minimum wage laws are not just ineffective. Their worst feature is not that they cause economic damage. They also damage the fabric of civil society by encouraging the government is your savior mindset. Minimum wage laws are not a textbook example of policy making with good intentions that produce bad unintended consequences. They are evil in their methods, coercion, and evil in their goals to make people believe they're dependent on government. The moral of the story is that minimum wage laws are designed to make the poor people dependent on government handouts while helping their proponents gain more power, money, and respect. Thank you for coming tonight. We'll stay with my co-author to discuss the presentation lessons, take your questions. The online live stream is now ended. Thank you.